The trouble began with a letter that arrived on an otherwise uneventful Tuesday afternoon, tucked neatly between a utility bill and a coupon booklet. At first glance, it looked like every other notice the HOA sent. Same neutral envelope, same crisp formatting. But there was something different about the tone as soon as it was opened. It carried a severity that seemed wildly disproportionate to the alleged offense. According to the board, the homeowner's grass, particularly one small, irregular patch near the front walkway, was deemed non-compliant. The phrase was printed in bold, followed by a list of violations that didn't quite make sense. Words like inconsistent coloration, textural disharmony, and aesthetic imbalance appeared as if they had been pulled from a pretentious landscaping catalog. The homeowner stared at the page, baffled. The rest of the lawn looked perfectly fine. Lush green, trimmed as it always had been. The patch in question was barely 2 feet wide, hardly noticeable except under close inspection. But the letter made it sound like the lawn was an eyesore threatening the architectural integrity of the entire neighborhood. Attached to the notice was a warning. If the grass was not corrected within 7 days, daily fines would begin accumulating. The threat was written in careful legal language, designed to sound neutral while establishing absolute authority. Confusion gave way to irritation. The homeowner knew the HOA had a tendency to overreach, but this crossed into absurdity. The lawn had been maintained consistently, watered regularly, and professionally fertilized. The small patch had simply grown a shade lighter during a recent heat wave, something that would resolve naturally. Yet here the HOA was, acting as if a looming catastrophe had been discovered. The homeowner took a slow walk outside, studying the small patch of grass under the afternoon sun. It wasn't perfect, but nothing in nature was. Still, it didn't seem like the kind of thing that warranted penalties. Neighbors passed by, offering friendly waves, none of them showing the slightest sign of being visually offended by the supposed lawn crisis. But as the homeowner surveyed the surrounding homes, it became clear that the offense had less to do with aesthetics and more to do with control. The HOA board members were known for micromanaging the community with increasing zeal each passing year. The following days brought escalating notices. The HOA claimed the issue had not been addressed, despite the fact that the homeowner had already reseeded the patch and watered it carefully. Each new letter grew more forceful. There were warnings about upcoming fines, mentions of community standards, and repeated insistence that the grass remained out of compliance. No matter what the homeowner did, the HOA claimed the effort was inadequate. What made things worse was the discovery that one specific board member had been frequently driving past the house, slowing down each time to inspect the lawn with exaggerated scrutiny. A self-appointed guardian of neighborhood perfection, this board member had gained a reputation for petty rule enforcement, often targeting the smallest deviations with theatrical seriousness. It explained the language in the letters. This was personal for someone, or at least an opportunity to flex authority. By the end of the week, the situation had escalated into something ridiculous. A final notice arrived, stating that daily fines would begin the following morning. The amount wasn't enormous per day, but it would add up quickly. The tone of the letter implied inevitability, as if the board believed no homeowner could or would resist their directives. It was a quiet, smug confidence that assumed compliance was the only possible outcome. That assumption was their mistake. The irritation that had simmered throughout the week solidified into a steady, determined resolve. The homeowner wasn't against maintaining the lawn. The issue was the principle behind the enforcement. The HOA had drawn an unnecessary line in the sand, and instead of backing down, they chose to escalate. So the homeowner decided to escalate as well, just not in the way the board expected. Late that evening, under the fading dusk light, the homeowner began researching more creative landscaping options. The goal wasn't merely to fix the patch of grass. The goal was to find something the HOA couldn't control, ban, or nitpick. Something fully within legal limits, yet outrageous enough to expose the absurdity of the board's obsession with conformity. Hours passed scrolling through yard design concepts, city regulations, community guidelines, and a surprising number of alternative lawn ideas. And then, somewhere between drought-tolerant landscapes and decorative hardscaping, the perfect idea emerged. It was bold. It was unorthodox. And best of all, it was completely allowed. Planning began immediately. Measurements were taken, materials were priced, and installation logistics were quietly arranged. No permits were needed. No rules were being broken. Everything fell within the narrow parameters the HOA had set, parameters they likely assumed no one would ever bother exploiting. The homeowner smiled at the thought. If they wanted to nitpick a patch of grass, they were about to see what nitpicking really looked like. The following morning, before the HOA could even send their first daily fine, a truck arrived carrying the supplies. The workers began unloading materials onto the driveway. Pallets, stones, bags of substrate, decorative pieces, and a few items so large and unconventional that neighbors paused to stare. Word spread quickly, and soon a small cluster of curious residents began forming along the sidewalk. The HOA board member who had been driving past all week happened to come by again, slowing to a near stop as eyes widened in disbelief. But nothing could be done. No rules were being broken. No violations were occurring. Everything going into the yard was compliant, documented, and protected by the community's own guidelines. Over the next several hours, the plain front lawn transformed into something entirely unexpected. A dramatic centerpiece that couldn't be fined, ordered to be removed, or adjusted to someone else's taste. It was a masterpiece of legal landscaping, a deliberate statement wrapped in creativity, and a subtle reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply following the rules more intelligently than the people who enforce them. By sunset, the installation was complete. The homeowner stepped back to admire the result. There was a deep, satisfying sense of triumph. Not loud, not reckless, but calm and absolute. The HOA wanted the grass fixed. Instead, they got something far grander, something they never anticipated, and something they had no power to control. And as night settled over the neighborhood, the board member made one last slow pass down the street, staring in stunned silence at what had taken the place of that tiny patch of non-compliant grass. What started as petty enforcement had evolved into a clash the HOA wasn't prepared for. And the real fallout, well, that was still to come. The following morning, the neighborhood woke to an unexpected tension in the air. The sun had barely risen, yet people were already out walking dogs or sipping coffee on porches, their gazes drifting, sometimes discreetly, sometimes openly, toward the newly transformed front yard. Word had spread so fast that it seemed the entire community had made it their unofficial mission to witness the result of the homeowner's bold decision. What now sat in place of the standard suburban lawn was a pristine, meticulously arranged rock garden. An ornamental xeriscape that combined polished river stones, desert succulents, sculpted gravel paths, and a centerpiece feature that drew the most attention: a towering, legally permitted, artistic stone monolith. It wasn't gaudy or disruptive. It was striking, undeniably unique, and more importantly, entirely compliant with every clause of the HOA's landscaping regulations. Even the most pedantic rule enforcer would find nothing to latch onto. Not color violations, not height restrictions, not maintenance clauses. The homeowner had anticipated each rule and matched it with precision. By mid-morning, the HOA president arrived on foot, clutching a clipboard as if it were a life vest in turbulent waters. The individual marched straight onto the sidewalk in front of the property, stopping only when confronted by the undeniable reality that no rule had been broken. The ornamental hardscape sat neatly within measurement limits. The monolith was classified as decorative art, something explicitly allowed, providing it didn't obstruct sidewalks or exceed specified height thresholds. It met all the requirements. The president stared for a long while, eyes flicking across the yard, searching desperately for something that could be interpreted as a violation. But the yard offered no foothold, no opening, no leverage. It was a masterpiece constructed from the very language of the community guidelines they had enforced so rigidly. The homeowner, observing from behind the front window but hidden from sight, felt a quiet satisfaction. The point hadn't been to provoke rage for the sake of chaos. The goal was to demonstrate that the HOA's rigid rules, when applied obsessively, could just as easily be reversed onto the enforcers. They had wanted control. They had gotten compliance. In the most inconvenient form possible. As the day progressed, the HOA convened an emergency board meeting. The homeowner had expected this. The board was predictable in its desire to maintain authority. The meeting took place in the community room near the Central Park, and by noon, residents had already begun whispering about it. The story traveled quickly. Apparently, the board was debating whether the new landscaping fell within the spirit of the guidelines, a phrase often used when they lacked any legitimate grounds to challenge something. People chuckled at the phrase. Everyone knew that when the HOA resorted to arguing spirit over letter. It meant they were scrambling. The homeowner carried on with normal tasks that day, tidying the garage, managing work errands, and occasionally glancing out the window to observe the subtle parade of neighbors walking by, pretending not to stare too long. Many of them had their own grievances with the HOA. Some had endured warnings about mailbox colors, improperly stored trash bins, or visible garden tools. Now they watched with amusement as the usually immovable board confronted a problem they couldn't find a way to by late afternoon. The board meeting concluded, and word spread again, this time with hints of frustration. It appeared that the board had failed to find any actionable violation. People heard that the HOA president had suggested creating a new rule to ban excessively unconventional lawn modifications, but other board members hesitated. They knew any retroactive rule would be seen as petty, possibly even challengeable. The more they attempted to justify such a rule, the more foolish they risked appearing to the community. And then the board member who had repeatedly driven past the homeowner's property throughout the previous week made a move that revealed just how deeply the issue had gotten under their skin. They began drafting a special landscaping review, a rarely used procedure that allowed the board to evaluate unconventional designs for neighborhood conformity. This review required photographic documentation, several signatures, and a formal inspection. It was a process so bureaucratic and time-consuming that it usually deterred anyone from invoking it. However, this board member was determined. They returned to the property late in the afternoon, camera in hand, snapping photos from every angle, front, side, curbside, even crouching down at one point as if hoping a low angle would reveal something out of compliance. Their agitation was obvious. Neighbors passing by exchanged amused looks. They pretended to be out for casual walks, but the truth was unmistakable. They had come to witness the unraveling. The homeowner watched all of this with incredulity. The rock garden wasn't loud, dangerous, or obstructive. It didn't disrupt anyone's peace. It simply wasn't grass. And in the eyes of the board, particularly the board member who had initiated the fines, that was a provocation worth pursuing. That evening, a notice was taped to the homeowner's front door. The paper bore the official HOA letterhead and a stern headline announcing the upcoming special landscaping review. It stated that an inspection would take place within a week and that the homeowner would receive results shortly afterward. The tone was formal, but beneath the formality was a clear undercurrent of irritation. The HOA was hoping to regain control, even if they had to stretch procedural boundaries to do it. The homeowner didn't remove the notice immediately. Instead, they let it hang on the door for a while, knowing neighbors would see it. Sure enough, curious residents slowed their walks, reading the paper and whispering among themselves. Many shook their heads, recognizing the board's pattern of overextension. Some even smiled sympathetically. The rock garden had done more than frustrate the board. It had reminded the neighborhood that the HOA's power was only as strong as the willingness of residents to accept it. Inside the house, the homeowner contemplated the next steps. The goal had never been to escalate this into a full-scale battle, but at this point, it was clear that the HOA wasn't going to back down. They had taken a minor patch of grass and turned it into a crusade for control. So if they wanted to escalate, they would get escalation in the form of absolute, impenetrable compliance. A plan began to take shape, one even more legally airtight than the rock garden itself. Because if the HOA intended to conduct a special review, then every detail needed to be perfect, documented, cross-checked, and aligned with not only the HOA guidelines but the city's broader zoning and landscaping codes. And the homeowner intended to use those codes to make the HOA's meltdown even more spectacular as night settled across the neighborhood. The stone monolith cast a long shadow across the gravel path, its silhouette tall and unmovable. It was a fitting symbol for what was coming. A quiet resilience, planted firmly on the property, daring anyone to challenge it. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The week leading up to the official special landscaping review was filled with a growing undercurrent of anticipation. The HOA had never attempted such a procedure for something so trivial, and the entire community sensed the absurdity of it. Neighbors talked quietly on sidewalks, at mailboxes, and across driveways, their conversations swirling with a shared curiosity. How far would the HOA go, and how far would the homeowner push back? The homeowner spent those days preparing with a patience and thoroughness that bordered on surgical. Every element of the rock garden was measured again, documented meticulously, and compared against both HOA rules and city regulations. Copies were printed, sorted, and placed into a neatly organized folder. Each plant species was confirmed as drought-tolerant and non-invasive, each stone type verified as permissible, and the monolith's dimensions aligned flawlessly with the community's artistic yard feature guidelines. What the HOA had framed as a potential violation was, in reality, a masterpiece of compliance. And the homeowner intended to make that unmistakably clear. The morning of the inspection arrived with a crisp, quiet stillness. A trio of HOA board members made their way down the sidewalk, clipboards in hand, wearing expressions that merged determination with forced neutrality. The board member who had initiated the fines, a person whose posture now carried visible tension, led the group with a stiff gait. Residents emerged from their homes subtly, pretending to water plants or walk pets, though everyone knew the truth. The entire street had become an audience. Even those who typically avoided HOA politics were drawn in, curious to see how the board would handle the spectacle they themselves had created. The board approached the property with the air of investigators arriving at a crime scene, though the only thing awaiting them was a pristine, legally unassailable display of landscaping artistry. The rock garden gleamed in the morning light. The gravel patterns had been combed into smooth, symmetrical designs. The stone monolith stood as steady and dignified as ever. The succulents, freshly watered, looked vibrant and healthy, and the homeowner waited calmly, standing at the edge of the driveway, the folder of documents tucked under one arm. The review began with intense scrutiny. The board members circled the garden, making notes, measuring distances, and photographing every angle. They tested the height of the monolith. They examined the spacing of succulents. They crouched to check the depth of gravel in the path. Their expressions shifted from hope to frustration, to a creeping recognition that nothing was out of place. The board member who had championed the fines grew visibly irritated, flipping through papers with increasing agitation. It was as if they were searching for some hidden flaw, something overlooked, something to justify the battle they had insisted on waging. But the rock garden refused to cooperate. Its perfection had been designed with their scrutiny in mind. Finally, after an almost exaggerated period of inspection, the HOA stepped aside to conduct a whispered, huddled conversation. The homeowner observed quietly, aware of the shifting dynamic among the board members. Two of them showed signs of resignation. The third, the instigator, looked nearly frantic. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The small crowd of neighbors continued to gather, keeping a respectful distance while enjoying the spectacle. A few exchanged amused glances. Some sipped from coffee mugs they had very conveniently decided to bring outside that morning. When the board finally returned, their expressions revealed everything before a single word was spoken. The HOA president held a neutral facade that barely hid the uncomfortable truth. They had lost. They had pushed too hard, too fast, and too publicly, and the homeowner had responded with flawless compliance. There was no violation. There was no fine. There was no corrective action. There was only the board's embarrassment. The homeowner handed them the folder of documents, measurements, regulations, species lists, material certifications, city codes, offering it not as defiance but as a crisp, irrefutable demonstration of transparency. The president accepted it reluctantly, already knowing the contents would confirm what the review had revealed. The instigating board member's face hardened. Their jaw clenched. Their fingers tightened around their clipboard. Their frustration had begun to metastasize into anger. Not at the project itself, but at the inability to control it. Within minutes, the board dispersed. They walked away with stiff posture, retreating down the sidewalk with the hollow dignity of defeated officials. Neighbors watched them go, silence coating the air like a thin layer of dust. Once the board was out of sight, the tension released. Laughter rippled quietly across the street. People approached the homeowner with congratulatory smiles, offering subtle nods of approval. The battle appeared over. But the final victory didn't happen until the following week, when the HOA distributed their official newsletter, a document normally filled with reminders about trash can placement and pool hours. That month's edition included a new section, added hastily and with minimal finesse, announcing a proposal for an upcoming vote, a potential amendment to restrict non-traditional landscaping installations. The wording was vague enough to reveal its motive but specific enough for everyone to understand whom it targeted. And then came the fatal flaw. The newsletter also contained the voting results of the recent community feedback survey, a survey the HOA had distributed earlier that year to assess resident satisfaction. It had been an anonymous questionnaire, sent without much fanfare, intended to gauge opinions on HOA enforcement, community values, and board responsiveness. The results showed overwhelming dissatisfaction with the board's habit of overregulation. It revealed that most residents wanted fewer aesthetic rules, not more. And it showed that community trust in the HOA had steadily declined. The timing was catastrophic for the board. Within 2 days, residents began openly discussing the absurdity of the proposed amendment. Many pointed out that the homeowner's rock garden was not only attractive but water efficient, environmentally friendly, and far easier to maintain. Others were simply tired of the HOA's constant micromanagement. The movement spread fast. Someone started a petition not to restrict landscaping innovations, but to limit the HOA's control over them. Others suggested replacing certain board members in the next election cycle. A few even called for a reduction in HOA powers altogether. By the end of the month, the board quietly withdrew the proposed landscaping amendment. The instigating board member resigned shortly afterward, citing personal reasons. Though no one believed the phrasing for a moment. And as for the homeowner, life returned to normal, quiet, steady, and delightfully free from lawn-related harassment. The rock garden remained exactly where it was, standing as a permanent reminder of what could happen when a rule is used not as a tool for community harmony, but as a weapon for petty control. The monolith, in particular, became something of a neighborhood landmark. People often paused to look at it during evening walks. Some joked that it symbolized the downfall of overzealous enforcement. Others simply appreciated its beauty. And through it all, the homeowner never needed to say a single confrontational word. The revenge had been carried out entirely through patience, creativity, and impeccable compliance. The HOA had demanded perfection. They had received it, and it was the last thing they wanted.